Emily Lyle had lived completely alone for 3 years. No one to talk to, no one to trust. Her days stretched long and quiet. The only sound the wind sweeping through the barren fields. She had learned to live in solitude, her heart thickened by grief and betrayal, her mind echoing with the weight of her past. And then, one day, everything changed. It happened on a bright spring afternoon in Willow's End, a town as unforgiving as the dry plains surrounding it. The auction yard was filled with the usual noise. Livestock calls, the stomping of hooves, the cries of men haggling over cattle and goods. Emily had come into town to sell a few items from her small homestead, keeping her head low and her eyes on the ground. She wasn't used to facing the people who once called her neighbor, but there was no choice. She needed supplies. The trouble started in the dry goods store when a silver comb, a gift from her late husband, went missing. It wasn't worth much, but the accusation came quick and heavy. Emily had barely said a word before the townsfolk turned their eyes toward her, suspicion written in every stare. The storekeeper, his face red and full of contempt, pointed a trembling finger in her direction. "You stole it, Emily Lyle," he spat. She stood still, her heart racing. She hadn't taken the comb, but the words, the judgment, it stung like 1,000 needles. The town had already decided. Even the church members who had once smiled at her in the pews now avoided her gaze, whispering behind her back. It didn't matter that her husband had died just a few months before, leaving her alone and vulnerable. It didn't matter that she had no need to steal. All that mattered was that someone needed to be blamed, and Emily Lyle was as good a target as any. Marshal Bragg, the town sheriff, arrived to oversee the scene. His boots echoed on the wooden platform, and as he climbed onto the auction block, Emily's heart sank. The crowd fell silent as he turned to face her, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Miss Lyle, I'm afraid we've got a problem here." The crowd shifted, murmurs floating in the air like a sickly fog. Emily stood frozen, her hands clasped tightly at her sides. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. Her eyes remained steady, her chin lifted slightly in quiet defiance. She wouldn't let them see her break, not in front of all these people, not in front of the ones who had once called her friend. Bragg's voice cut through the silence again. "We'll take her to the jail and sort this out. If she's guilty, the punishment will be harsh." The people jeered, some shaking their heads in disgust. Others looked away, pretending not to notice. No one stood to speak on her behalf. The weight of their silence pressed down on her like a heavy stone, suffocating her breath. Just as Bragg made his move, a tall figure in a threadbare coat stepped forward from the crowd. He was quiet, like a shadow slipping through the cracks of daylight. The people parted as he walked toward the platform, his boots barely making a sound on the wooden floor. Marshal Bragg paused and looked him up and down. "You got business here, cowboy?" he asked with a sneer. The stranger didn't answer. He didn't need to. He simply looked at Emily with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of storms and stories untold. His gaze was soft yet strong, filled with a quiet authority that made the crowd shrink back. There was something in his eyes, something familiar to Emily, something that made her heart skip. The man didn't speak. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a silver coin, placing it gently into Bragg's hand. He didn't argue, didn't shout, didn't defend. He just offered what seemed like a simple, silent solution. "I'll take her," the stranger said, his voice low and steady. The sheriff glanced at the coin in his hand, then back at the man. There was hesitation, then a slow nod. "She's yours," Bragg grumbled, clearly displeased, but unwilling to argue with someone who didn't seem afraid of him. The man's eyes met Emily's one more time before he gently took her bound arms and helped her down from the platform. The crowd parted, and she walked beside him, stunned and silent. No one said a word as they left the auction yard, the soft sound of hooves on dirt the only noise that followed them. They didn't speak on the ride, and Emily wasn't sure if she was relieved or confused. She had never seen this man before, and yet there was something in his presence that made her feel, if only for a moment, that she wasn't entirely alone in the world. Something she had long ago thought she had lost. But there was a question that lingered, and she couldn't shake it. Who was this man, and why had he stepped forward to help her? What was his story, and what did he see in her that made him care? She would soon find out. But for now, she simply rode beside him, the weight of the past still heavy in her chest, the sting of the town's judgment still fresh. The road ahead was uncertain, but there was one thing Emily knew for sure. Her life had just taken a turn she hadn't expected. And everything was about to change. What he did next would change both their lives forever. George Walker didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened. He was a man of few words, but there was something in his presence, a quiet authority that demanded respect. As he led Emily away from the auction yard, his hand gently touched hers, guiding her like a leaf carried by the wind. The crowd watched in silence, unsure of what to make of this stranger who had stepped in to defend her, but no one dared speak against him. George didn't ask for approval or recognition. He simply did what he felt was right. They rode in silence, the only sound the rhythmic clop of hooves against the hard-packed dirt road. Emily was still in a daze, her mind racing with questions. Who was this man? Why had he come for her? She glanced over at him, taking in the worn lines of his face, the weathered look of someone who had lived through hardship. He didn't look like a man who had much to give, yet there was something about him that seemed to shine through the quiet. She wanted to ask him why he had helped, but the words stuck in her throat. What was there to say? In her mind, she couldn't fathom someone caring enough to stand up for her. After all, she had nothing left to offer. Her home, her reputation, even her own sense of self. She felt as though all of it had been stripped away by the people she once knew. They reached the outskirts of town, and the land around them began to open up, stretching wide and empty like the life she had once dreamed of, but now felt beyond her reach. George's small ranch was on the far side of a hill, nestled between pines and rocks, with a modest cabin standing just beyond a sagging fence. The smoke rising from the chimney seemed almost like an invitation, the warmth of it beckoning her. When they arrived, George didn't rush. He dismounted, offering Emily his hand to help her down. She accepted without a word, her feet landing softly on the ground, as if she were walking on something fragile, something that could break at any moment. He led her into the cabin without asking, without speaking a word of explanation. There were no grand gestures, no flowery promises, just a quiet sense of understanding. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and something earthy, the kind of smell that made you feel like you were far from the world, in a place where time itself slowed down. George offered her water, a simple towel, and a bowl of stew. He didn't ask if she was hungry. It was clear from the way he moved, the way his hands were steady as he served her, that he knew the value of silence. He didn't need to say much. His actions spoke for him. Emily sat at the small table, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of her bowl. She didn't know what to make of it all. For the first time in weeks, she felt the faintest stirrings of peace, though she wasn't sure how to hold on to it. The man who had come to her aid didn't push her for answers or demand explanations. He simply existed in the same quiet space as her, letting her take whatever time she needed to breathe. She found herself drawn to the fire in the corner of the room, where George sat, his face half lit by the flickering light. There was something deeply familiar about him, but she couldn't place it. Her mind was too cluttered with memories of the auction, of the way the townsfolk had turned on her, to focus on anything else. It wasn't until she saw the initials stitched into the corner of one of the quilts that something shifted inside her. M.W. They were simple letters, delicate and neat, but they stopped her in her tracks. Mary Walker. The name was a quiet echo in her mind, a whisper of something she should know. She looked at George, who was keeping his distance, sitting by the fire with his head bent low, lost in thought. The pieces slowly began to fall into place. This wasn't just any stranger. He was the brother of Mary Walker, the young woman who had once been the town's greatest scandal. Mary had been pregnant out of wedlock, a fate that had been a death sentence in a place like Willow's End. No one had stood by her. No one had offered her a hand. And then she had died, alone, just as Emily had feared she would. But George hadn't forgotten her. Emily could see it in the way he carried himself, in the way he looked at her now, as though seeing a reflection of something long buried in the ashes of his grief. She realized that he understood what it felt like to be alone, to be cast aside by everyone you thought you could count on. "I'm sorry for what happened to her," Emily whispered, the words coming from a place of understanding that she hadn't known existed. George didn't answer immediately, but his eyes softened as he turned to face her. The fire crackled between them, but the silence between them was no longer heavy. It was a shared quiet, one where words weren't necessary. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady. She was pregnant. The town didn't care. No one helped her when she needed it. I couldn't protect her, but I won't fail someone else. Emily felt something stir in her chest, a quiet gratitude, and something more, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. For the first time since her life had fallen apart, she didn't feel entirely lost. George had offered her more than just shelter from the storm. He had offered her a kind of understanding, a promise that not all was lost. Not yet. She didn't know what came next or how long she would stay here, but she had no choice but to trust him. She could see, in the quiet moments between them, that she was no longer alone. And in that moment, she allowed herself the smallest hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a future for her yet. But as the fire flickered and the night deepened, she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into that town hours earlier. Not anymore. For the first time in months, Emily felt something she thought she'd lost forever. But could she trust it? Could she trust him? The morning light filtered through the small window of the cabin, its soft rays falling over Emily as she stirred in the quiet warmth of the blankets. She blinked slowly, unsure if she was still dreaming or if this was some fleeting moment of peace that she had once believed beyond her reach. The fire had burned low in the hearth, but the smell of pine and wood smoke lingered in the air, a scent that made her feel oddly safe. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't waking up to the harsh realities of a world that had turned its back on her. She was somewhere different, somewhere untainted by judgment or shame. The silence that had once felt oppressive was now a balm, soothing her weary soul. As she sat up, stretching her arms above her head, she saw George outside, chopping wood with methodical precision. The rhythmic sound of the axe meeting the log was the only noise breaking the early morning stillness. She watched him for a moment, noticing how his broad shoulders moved with each swing, the muscles in his back shifting beneath the worn fabric of his shirt. There was something deeply grounding in the way he moved, something that spoke of a life lived without pretense or artifice. Emily felt a strange pull toward him, an unspoken connection that she didn't yet fully understand. He wasn't asking anything of her, wasn't pressuring her to explain herself. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she had to defend her every action. The days that followed settled into a quiet routine. George didn't push her to speak of the past, nor did he rush her to fill the silence. He let her be, letting her find her place in his world, which seemed so simple, yet so different from the one she had left behind. She helped him around the ranch, stacking kindling, tending to the small garden beside the cabin, and even helping with the cooking. She found solace in the simplicity of these tasks, in the way the days unfolded with no expectations other than the need to survive. Sometimes she would catch George watching her from across the room, his expression unreadable, but there was a warmth in his eyes that made her feel something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years, human. The shared silences between them spoke volumes. They didn't need words to understand each other. It was as if they both knew what it meant to be broken, to be abandoned by the world, and yet still, somehow, still exist. But Emily was aware of the fragility of it all, of the temporary nature of this peace. She couldn't stay hidden forever. She knew the world outside would never forget what had happened in Willow's End, and eventually, someone would come looking for her. And then what? Would George's quiet sanctuary be enough to shield them from the storm that was sure to come? One afternoon, as Emily was sitting on the porch, gazing out at the horizon, an elderly woman came walking up the dirt path toward the cabin. Mrs. Corbin, George's neighbor, was known for her gossiping ways and had a knack for finding out things that others preferred to keep hidden. She was carrying a loaf of bread wrapped in a cloth, but it was the look in her eyes that gave Emily pause. There was something more than just the usual neighborly visit in the way Mrs. Corbin looked at her. "You're settling in fine, I see," Mrs. Corbin remarked, her voice raspy with age. "But I hope you know, the town's still riled up. They haven't forgotten." Emily's stomach tightened. She had been hoping to forget, to disappear into the quiet of this place. But it seemed the past was determined to follow her. "Bragg's been talking, and he's not one to let things go," Mrs. Corbin continued, her eyes darting over her shoulder as if ensuring no one was listening. "He says you made a fool of him. Men like that bruise easy. They don't forget." Emily nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She had seen that look in the town's eyes before, the look of people eager to punish, eager to turn a blind eye to their own sins as they condemn someone else. "You're safer here," Mrs. Corbin added, though there was no comfort in her words. "But I wouldn't be too sure it'll stay quiet." Emily's heart sank. She had hoped that by running, she could escape her past, that she could find peace here with George. But she could see now that the storm was already gathering on the horizon. It was only a matter of time before someone from Willow's End would show up, demanding answers, demanding retribution. "What will you do?" Mrs. Corbin asked, as though reading the thoughts that Emily hadn't voiced. Emily swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet the old woman's gaze. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of all that had come before. "I thought I could start over," she continued, her voice shaking just slightly. "But I can't outrun the past." Mrs. Corbin's expression softened, and for a brief moment, Emily saw the woman as more than just a gossiper. She was someone who understood the weight of survival, who understood the need to protect what little you had left. "Sometimes we all need to run," Mrs. Corbin said quietly. "But running doesn't always make the past disappear." With that, she turned and walked back down the path, leaving Emily standing on the porch, feeling the weight of her own uncertainty. She had been hiding, hoping that the distance from Willow's End would be enough to keep the past at bay. But the reality was harsh. She couldn't stay hidden forever. She would have to face the town again, face the accusations and the consequences. But there was one thing she hadn't expected. This place, this quiet sanctuary, had become something more than just a refuge. It had become a home. And George had become more than just a stranger who had come to her aid. He had become a reminder that not all was lost, that kindness still existed in the world. But could it protect them when the storm finally came? Could they stay safe here, or would they be swept away by the world they had tried to leave behind? The town hadn't forgotten, and they weren't finished with her yet. The knock on the door came just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the cabin. Emily froze, her breath caught in her throat as she looked at George, who had been sitting by the fire, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames. The air between them had been thick with quiet for the past few days, each of them lost in their own thoughts. But now, with that knock, it felt as though everything was about to change. George didn't seem startled by the sound. He simply stood and walked to the door without a word. Emily's heart raced as she stood behind him, her hand gripping the back of the chair. She knew who it was even before the door creaked open. Marshal Bragg's voice was unmistakable. "You've been harboring a criminal, Walker," he said, his tone full of venom, the words dragging in the cold night air. Emily's blood ran cold, and she instinctively took a step back, But George didn't flinch. He stood tall, his gaze calm, unwavering, as he faced Bragg and his two deputies. "She's done nothing wrong," George replied, his voice steady but firm, as if there was no question in his mind. He didn't shout, didn't make threats. He simply spoke the truth as he saw it. But Bragg wasn't interested in truth. He was interested in power, in proving that no one in Willow's Inn could stand against him. "She's a thief, and that's all she'll ever be." "You're making a fool of yourself, Walker," Bragg sneered, stepping closer to George. "And this won't be the last time I'll be here. If you think you're safe with her under your roof, you're wrong. We can make things real difficult for you." George's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. "If you want to make things difficult, you'll have to go through me," he said, his tone low and unwavering. Bragg glared at him, clearly enraged, but there was a hesitation in his eyes. He knew George was no fool, and he wasn't about to pick a fight he couldn't win. With a final sneer, Bragg turned on his heel. "This ain't over, Walker," he growled before he and his deputies disappeared into the darkness. George stood in the doorway for a moment longer, his hand resting on the frame as if he were bracing himself against something heavier than just the sheriff's threats. Emily watched him, her heart aching for him. She had seen the determination in his eyes, but she also saw the burden that came with it, the cost of standing up for what was right in a town where wrongs were swept under the rug. She wanted to speak, wanted to say something to ease his worry, but the words stuck in her throat. The weight of the moment hung heavy between them. George closed the door softly, his shoulders slumping just the slightest bit as the tension in the room began to ease. "They'll be back," he muttered, more to himself than to Emily, though she heard the truth of it in his voice. "They don't forget easily." Emily felt a chill seep in her bones. She knew what Bragg's words meant. George had a ranch to protect, a home to keep, and now, it seemed, he had to protect her as well. She was a threat to his way of life, a woman marked by the town's judgment, and the more he defended her, the more he risked losing everything he had worked for. The thought twisted in her gut. He had done nothing wrong. He had simply offered her kindness when no one else would. And yet, that kindness was now a danger, a reason for the town to target him. "George," Emily whispered, her voice trembling as she crossed the room to where he stood. She placed a hand on his arm, the touch soft, but it was a tether, a quiet offering of her own strength. He turned to look at her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, those eyes that had held so much sorrow and understanding, met hers. She saw it then, the truth of it, the decision he had already made. He would not back down, would not allow her to be abandoned again, not while he had the power to protect her. But Emily knew the cost. "I can't stay here, George," she said, her voice a whisper, as if the words themselves were heavy enough to crush her. He frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean? If they come back, if they take you to the town council, they'll take your land. They'll make sure you lose everything," she said, each word like a weight being added to her chest. "I can't let that happen. I can't let them destroy your life for me." His silence was deafening as she spoke, and when she finished, the room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in around her. She knew what she had to do, and it felt like the only choice left. "I'm leaving," she said, the decision final in her mind, even though it tore at her heart. She couldn't stay. She wouldn't be the cause of his downfall, not after all the kindness he had shown her. "You don't have to do this," George said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. But the resolve in Emily's eyes made it clear that her mind was set. She couldn't risk his future for the sake of her own survival. Later that night, after George had fallen into a deep sleep, Emily packed a small bundle, just the essentials. She slipped the carved wooden bird George had been making into the bag, along with one of Mary's dresses and a loaf of bread. She had written him a note, a quiet farewell. "You gave me kindness when the world gave me stones. I won't let them take your home for it. You showed me I was still worth saving. Thank you. E." She folded it carefully, placed it on the table, and tiptoed out the door. She moved swiftly, silently into the cold night air, heading for the woods that surrounded the ranch. Behind her, the cabin remained dark, the fire and the hearth long gone cold. As Emily disappeared into the trees, George woke to find a note on the table, his heart sinking as he read her words. He ran outside, calling her name, but the only response was the whisper of the wind through the trees. His gaze fell on the distant outline of her figure as she disappeared into the wilderness, and with a fist clenched around the note, he knew that she had left. His heart broke, and the world suddenly felt as empty as the land around him. And so they parted, her footsteps fading into the wilderness, his heart breaking in the doorway. 3 years would pass before they saw each other again. 3 years passed since Emily disappeared into the wilderness, and George Walker's life became a mechanical routine, one that lacked meaning despite his efforts to keep the ranch going. Each day bled into the next, the work endless and solitary. He had hoped, at first, that Emily would return, that somehow, despite her decision to leave, she would find her way back to him. But as the seasons changed, so did his hope, until it became a quiet ache, a reminder of the life he had almost built and the woman he had nearly loved. He kept the wooden bird Emily had left behind, now finished, but it lay on a shelf, a silent testament to the years of waiting, of wondering what could have been. He'd heard whispers of her, stories carried by travelers and old acquaintances who had seen her in the distance, a woman living alone on a homestead far from Willow's End. But the reports were always vague, and George never dared venture too close, fearing that if he did, he might find the truth he wasn't ready to face. He continued to carve, continued to work, but there was no joy in it. There was no fire in his chest anymore, just the dull rhythm of survival. In town, people spoke in hushed tones about Emily. Some claimed to have seen her. Others insisted she had vanished without a trace. But no one ever said her name without judgment. Willow's End had turned its back on her long ago, and the same fate seemed inevitable for anyone who dared to stand by her. And yet, George had never been able to let go of her memory. He carried her note with him everywhere, folded in his coat pocket, never willing to part with it. His world had become as gray as the sky on the cold mornings when he rose to the same routine. It wasn't until Mrs. Corbin, with her usual sharp eyes and subtle concern, confronted him that the truth of it all hit him like a gust of wind on an open plain. 3 years, George, she said one afternoon as she watched him mending a fence. You can't keep going like this. Her voice was low, but there was no mistaking the concern there. You're living in the past, and the past got a tight grip on you. George didn't answer, only glanced at her, knowing that the truth of her words rang too loudly to deny. He had let the years slip by, letting grief and uncertainty dictate his life. You can't keep running from what you lost, she added, a little softer now, as if offering him the courage to move forward. If you want to know where she went, I know where she is. She didn't leave because she wanted to be lost. She left to protect you. The words hit George like a hammer. He had spent years believing that Emily had left because of something he had done, or perhaps because she had never truly wanted him. But the truth was, she had made a sacrifice for him. She had left because staying would have put him in danger. The thought crushed him, made him feel more foolish for not understanding sooner. Without another word, George turned from Mrs. Corbin, his mind already racing. He had to find her. He had to know if she had found peace, if she had found a life that was her own, or if she was still living with the weight of her past. He wasn't sure what he expected, but he knew he couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. Mrs. Corbin gave him the direction he needed, just a small homestead past Miller's Creek, far from town. And though she hesitated, she finally spoke. She's out there, George, but you should know she might not want to be found. She made her choice 3 years ago, and she might not want you in her life again. He knew that she was right. He could never force Emily to come back, never expect her to forgive him for not coming sooner. But he needed to try, packing only the essentials, some flour, salt, sugar, and the finished bird. he set off the very next day. As he rode, his mind raced with thoughts of what he would say, how he would explain himself after all this time. He practiced his words out loud, over and over, but each time the words felt hollow. There was so much he needed to say, so much regret he needed to express, but it seemed impossible to fit everything into a few sentences. He wasn't sure if Emily would even want to see him, or if she had moved on with her life. It was a gamble, one that could end in more pain, more rejection, but the risk of never knowing was far greater than the risk of facing her. The journey was long and rough, the trail cutting through thick forest and over rocky terrain. By the time he reached Miller's Creek, George was tired, his clothes stiff with dust, his body aching from the ride. But when he saw the small, weathered cabin in the distance, the smoke rising from the chimney, his heart skipped a beat. He dismounted and walked slowly toward the cabin, the world around him feeling quiet and still. For a moment, he stood there, watching through the window, trying to catch a glimpse of her. And then there she was. He saw her inside, moving with a grace that seemed so familiar, and yet there was something different about her now. She had changed. She had lived these 3 years without him, had built a life of her own. His heart clenched with both hope and fear. Would she see him as the man who had failed her? Or would she see the one who had finally come to find her, to make right the years of silence? He raised his hand, uncertain, and as he stepped closer to the door, the finality of the moment hit him. He had found her. Now, it was up to her whether she would open the door or whether she would turn him away forever. With a deep breath, he raised his hand to knock. 3 years of silence stood between them. One knock would shatter it. Would she open the door or turn him away forever? George stood in front of Emily's cabin, his heart pounding in his chest, the cold air biting at his skin as he stood frozen in place. He had ridden for days, over rough trails and through dense woods, following the small clues Mrs. Corbin had given him. But now, standing just feet from the door, he wasn't sure what to expect. Would she open it and let him in? Would she turn him away, just like he had feared? 3 years had passed since she left, and the silence between them had only deepened, stretching longer than either of them had ever imagined. He thought he was prepared for anything, but as his hand hovered above the door, it was as if his body had forgotten how to move. His mind raced through memories of the quiet moments shared on the ranch, of the way Emily's eyes had softened when she spoke of her past, and of the promise he had made to himself after she left. He would never forget her. He had never wanted to live a life of regret, but the years had stacked up, each one reminding him of the decision he had made not to follow her, not to search for her sooner. He had let her slip away, believing she was better off without him. But now everything had changed. He had found her, and standing here in the cold night, he was ready to face the consequences of his inaction. He couldn't change the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could start again. The sound of footsteps inside the cabin reached his ears, and his heart stopped. She was coming. He could hear her moving, the soft shuffle of boots on the wooden floor, the quiet rustle of fabric. Then, the door creaked open, just a crack, and he found himself staring into the face he hadn't seen in so long. Emily's eyes met his, and for a moment, neither of them said a word. She looked the same, yet different. There was a quiet strength in her gaze that hadn't been there before, a resilience that spoke of the years she had spent alone, building a life without him. Her hair was longer, pulled back into a simple braid, and she wore a faded dress that seemed to speak of time spent in the quiet corners of the world, away from the judgment and whispers of others. She looked tired, but there was something else there too, a kind of peace that George hadn't expected to see. "George," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that swept through the trees. For a moment, the sound of her name on his lips was all he could hear. "You left," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush, as if he couldn't keep them in any longer. He hadn't meant to say it that way, hadn't meant to make it sound like an accusation, but it had been a truth that had eaten at him for 3 long years. The moment she left had been the moment he realized how much he had taken her for granted, how much he had assumed she would stay, that everything would somehow fix itself. And when she had disappeared into the wilderness, leaving nothing but a note and the silence of her absence, it had been like a wound that refused to heal. But now, standing in front of her, he saw that silence had not been her punishment. It had been his. Emily's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, the world between them seemed to vanish. She stepped back slightly, enough for him to step inside, but still, the distance between them remained. She didn't invite him in, but she didn't stop him either. He entered the cabin, the familiar warmth of the fire and the smell of wood smoke wrapping around him like a blanket. He didn't know what to say, how to explain the years that had passed, the years he had spent believing she was better off without him. But Emily spoke first. "I had to leave, George," she said quietly, her voice trembling just slightly. I thought I was protecting you. I thought if I stayed, they would take everything from you. The land, your ranch, everything you worked for." She shook her head, her eyes distant for a moment, as if she were reliving the pain of those days. "I couldn't let that happen. Not because of me." Her words hit him like a fist to the chest. He had spent years believing that she had left because of something he had done, because she didn't want him. But the truth was so much more complicated. She hadn't left him because she didn't love him. She had left because she loved him too much to let him suffer the consequences of his decision to help her. "Emily," he said, his voice low, full of regret, full of understanding. "I should have come sooner. I should have found you." He reached out, but she stepped back just out of reach. "I couldn't stay, George. I thought I was doing the right thing, but..." She paused, tears welling up in her eyes as she looked at him. "I thought I would be forgotten. I thought you would be better off without me." The words were out before she could stop them, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel the weight of everything she had carried alone. "I never forgot you," George whispered, his voice full of quiet intensity. "I've carried your note with me every day. I've thought about you every day." He stepped closer, his breath coming in shallow bursts, the emotion welling up in his chest like a river ready to overflow. "I couldn't forget you. I tried, but it didn't work." Emily's eyes searched his face, and for the first time in a long time, she saw the truth in his eyes. She saw the man she had left behind, the man who had cared for her in a way that no one else had, the man who had never stopped loving her. She felt the knot in her chest loosen just slightly, the fear that had held her in place for so long beginning to unravel. "You should have come sooner," she whispered, the words a quiet confession. "I wanted you to come, but I thought you'd forget me." The silence between them was thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that only happens when two people finally stop running from what they both already know. George reached out, his hand shaking slightly, and gently cupped her face, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. "I couldn't forget you," he repeated, his voice so gentle it was almost a plea. "And I won't let you go again." There was a long pause, and in that silence, everything shifted. The years between them didn't matter anymore. The town, the shame, the silence, it didn't matter. Only this moment mattered. And in it, they were no longer two broken people trying to survive. They were two souls finally coming together, finally ready to face whatever came next. George lowered his hand, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, when the words came, they were simple, but they carried the weight of everything they had been through. "Will you be my wife?" George asked, his voice a little shaky, but full of hope. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had waited so long for this moment, for the moment when the world would stop turning, when time would stand still, and she would finally be able to say what her heart had known all along. She looked into his eyes, her own tears slipping down her cheeks as she whispered, "Yes." George's face broke into a smile, and for the first time in years, they both felt the weight of the past lift. Silence stretches, Emily trembling, tears streaming. "George," You don't have to answer now." The moment Emily said yes, the world around them seemed to shift, like a storm finally passing and revealing the first light of dawn. George's heart pounded in his chest, a mix of relief and joy washing over him. For 3 years, he had lived in the shadow of regret, in the silence of what-ifs and could-have-beens. Now, in this simple, quiet cabin, with the fire crackling softly behind them, he had the answer he had been waiting for. Emily was his, and for the first time in years, he knew exactly what he wanted. He wanted to build a life with her, a life they could call their own, free of the past, free of the judgment that had followed her, and free of the fears that had held them both captive. Emily's hand was trembling as she reached for his, and George held it gently, as if afraid that if he squeezed too hard, she might disappear. They both knew that their journey wasn't over. It would never truly be over. There would be challenges ahead, and the world outside would not simply forget the past. They would face that together side by side. "I don't know what comes next," Emily whispered, her voice full of uncertainty. But there was a new strength in her tone now, a quiet courage that George had never heard before. "I don't know what I've been missing all this time, or how to make up for it." George shook his head, his fingers gently brushing her cheek. "You don't have to make up for anything, Emily. You've been through enough already. This is our time. We'll make a new future together." Emily closed her eyes at his touch, the warmth of his hand on her skin grounding her, making her feel like she was finally home. All the fear that had gripped her for so long, fear of the town, fear of herself, fear of being rejected again, began to melt away. She had been running for so long, but now, standing here with George, she realized that the running had never been the answer. What mattered now was that they had found each other again, that they were standing on the edge of a new beginning. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew she wasn't alone anymore. "We'll marry quietly," George said, his voice steady and calm, as if he had already thought through every detail. "No big ceremony, just the preacher, Mrs. Corbin, and a few others. We'll keep it simple." Emily smiled, a small, bittersweet smile. It wasn't what she had imagined when she thought of her wedding day, but it was everything she needed. For once, the smallness of it didn't feel like something to mourn. It felt like a gift, something real, something that they could make their own. And in that simplicity, she saw the beauty. "We'll need to pack," she said softly, glancing around the cabin. She had come here with nothing, just a few clothes, a bit of food, and the hope that she could disappear from the world that had turned its back on her. But now, the thought of leaving this place, of returning to a town that had never forgiven her, made her chest tighten. "I can't stay here anymore, George," she said, her voice breaking just a little. "I can't stay where everything reminds me of what I've lost." George nodded, understanding, his gaze softening. "We'll leave together," he said. "We'll go back to the ranch. We'll make it our home." He was quiet for a moment, his eyes searching hers, as if making sure she was certain. "But you'll always have this place if you need it," he added. "This cabin will always be here for you." Emily blinked, feeling the tears welling up in her eyes again. She didn't want to leave this place. It had become a sanctuary, a place where she had healed in ways she hadn't thought possible. But George was right. They couldn't stay here forever. They had to move forward, even if that meant returning to a place full of painful memories. But at least now, she wouldn't be facing those memories alone. As they began to pack her few belongings into a small bag, the reality of their new life together began to sink in. There was so much to look forward to, and yet so much to leave behind. It wasn't just the past that they were moving away from. It was the weight of fear, of shame, of everything that had held them back for so long. Together, they could face anything. The next morning, they packed the wagon with what little they had: clothes, a few pots and pans, and a small bundle of supplies. The wooden bird, the one George had carved for her so many months ago, sat on top, a symbol of what they had both been through. The journey back to Willow's End was quiet, but not in the way it had been when she first left. This time, Emily wasn't running away. She was returning, but with a different heart, a different purpose. George didn't speak much during the ride, but every so often he would glance over at her, his eyes filled with a quiet, unspoken promise. They didn't need to say anything. The comfort was in the stillness between them, in the simple act of being together after so long apart. As they passed through Willow's End, Emily kept her head high, her posture straight. There were no waves of recognition, no friendly smiles from old acquaintances, just the hushed whispers of people who saw them and turned away. Emily didn't flinch. She didn't look back. The past was no longer a weight she carried on her shoulders. She had made her choice. She was moving forward, and nothing would change that now. At the general store, the storekeeper gave them an awkward nod as they walked inside. He didn't meet her eyes, and he didn't offer any words of welcome. But there was a subtle shift in the air. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. "You're here," Mrs. Corbin said, her voice filled with tears as she caught sight of them. She was standing near the counter, holding a bundle of bread, and as soon as she saw them, she broke into a wide smile. "I knew he'd find you," she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "You're home now." Emily nodded, feeling a swell of emotion in her chest. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was a start. As they continued on their way, Emily's heart began to slow. They were almost there. The ranch was just ahead, and soon she would be standing in front of the small house where she would begin her new life. The house that would finally become a home. They reached the ranch just as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the land. The rolling hills, the quiet fields, they were all familiar, and yet everything felt different now. This wasn't just George's home anymore. It was theirs. The wedding was simple. Just a preacher, Mrs. Corbin, and a few neighbors who had been kind enough to stand witness. Emily wore a blue calico dress she had sewn herself, the same one she had never finished before. It was the only dress she had left, and somehow it felt perfect. As George recited his vows, Emily could hardly hold back the tears. "I promise to see you, even when you can't see yourself. To stand with you when the world stands against us," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. Emily's own vows were simple but true. "I promise to stay, even when I'm scared. To trust, even when it's hard. To build a life with you, that's ours alone." The preacher smiled as he pronounced them husband and wife. And when George kissed her, it was a kiss that held everything. 3 years of waiting, 3 years of longing, and the promise of a forever they had both thought lost. Epilogue. 1 year later, a year later, the ranch was thriving. The garden Emily had tended was full of life, the soil rich and bountiful. She was expecting their first child, and though she never said it aloud, her hand often rested on her growing belly, a silent acknowledgement of the new life they had built together. The silver comb that had once been a symbol of shame hung proudly on the wall, a reminder of how far she had come. And beside it, the wooden bird George had carved sat on the mantel, still a symbol of love, of hope, and of everything they had overcome. Marshall Bragg still passed through town on occasion, but whenever he saw Emily, he never spoke. They passed each other in silence, acknowledging the past, but no longer allowing it to define them. On a quiet evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Emily and George sat together on the porch, her hand resting on her growing belly, his hand over hers. The world had changed, and so had they. "Do you ever regret it?" Emily asked, her voice soft as she watched the sky turn pink and gold. George looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, abiding love. "Every day I didn't come sooner," he said. And as they sat together, watching the sunset, Emily knew that she had finally found her place in the world. Not just a place to live, but a place to love, to grow, and to call home. Emily Lyle had lived alone for 3 years, convinced she deserved nothing more. But when a quiet rancher knocked on her door and asked her to be his wife, She learned that sometimes the life you thought you lost is just waiting for you to be brave enough to claim it again. And in the wild, unforgiving West, two broken souls found something neither expected: a love that didn't need words, only presence. A forever built on grace, not judgment. A home built on choice, not chance.